Hello, Dr. Mance.
Hey, how are you, Jim? How's everything out
Uh,
there in Australia?
fantastic, fantastic. Good to meet with you once again and have a
Yeah,
nice,
I'm
fun
glad to see that
conversation.
you're continuing to get some sunshine out there.
Yeah, yeah, there's plenty of that. It's almost like too much. You have to worry about like the opposite thing here.
Uh-huh.
But the future is sunny because I'm a day ahead of you, so I'm calling you from the future.
Okay.
So it's
So what
April
does the
28th.
future have? What does the future
Yeah,
have in
there's
hold
more
for us,
quarantine.
Jim?
Yeah, tomorrow for you is more of the same self-isolation.
That's
It's gonna be great.
amazing, Jim. I mean,
Yeah,
your
yeah.
forecasting skill. Okay, go ahead.
Cool. So let's dive into some topics and
Mhm.
have a few, and I don't know if we'll get to them all, but the things that we've heard either from questions or been thinking about are quarantine fatigue,
Mhm.
taking advantage of the opportunities that might arise
Mhm.
since the world is changing. It might be a good time to make changes in our lives. And then a bit around fixations and a lot of conspiratorial thinking that we start to see more on social media. So let's see what we get to those out of those, and let's hit it off. So
Sure.
first, quarantine fatigue. So now
Mm.
it's like a month plus. You see that a lot of the statistics seem, maybe if we haven't completely gone over the curve, but there are at least some signs that places have peaked. Other
Mhm.
signs that maybe even like in Australia here, in New Zealand, the number of cases are very low.
Mhm.
So people start to get very tired of self-isolation. And they also, and I've noticed this myself, a little bit of feeling that some places have even gone overboard with some of the restrictions, like
Mhm.
beaches being closed and parks being closed or camping being closed, even for social distancing. So there's like a
Mhm.
bit of, say like a feeling like we want to get out of the house, but we also want to do the right thing. We don't want to go and just have the epidemic kind of resurge. So for people who, like me and others, who might be feeling like just tired of this lockdown, but yet acknowledging that we're still in the like beginning, early rounds, early innings of a long battle,
Mm.
how can we work with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasonings that may go into the quarantine fatigue, as you put it, that would be, I think, helpful to maybe address it from certain angles. And then obviously, if it doesn't cover all the things in which you were trying to hope to, you can always help redirect in that case. Uh, it comes back to that system we were talking about last week, that panic grief system that we were talking about, Jock Panksepp's primary emotional circuitry. So that panic grief system is one of the most powerful primary emotional circuitries that we have in the mammalian brain, including our brain. So that at first part, when everything was sort of shutting down and everything was new and all these terms like flattening the curve and all this other stuff was coming on board, there was a lot of like transition and learning, and then there was that kind of panicky feeling that a lot of us would have transiently. And then as time has gone on and kind of gone on and gone on, that then leads itself into the panic response, then kind of goes and shifts over into a grief and kind of shut down response. Because it's like, what are you going to do at this point? You're starting to feel more and more isolated. That system was designed to keep you connected. And oftentimes what's happening now is that most of us are feeling not connected and isolated. So that happens as we continue to feel that sense of isolation. The body signals to us to kind of shut down your metabolic rate, shut down your ability to just sort of like, do things and just sort of kind of plant your butt down and just be still. But there's also that other part of you, that thinking mind, whether it's to want to connect out there because you're recognizing this is sort of artificially imposed. Not sort of, it is. There's some good reasoning behind it, and also we're also noticing there's a lot of confusion out there as to, all right, how do we start to reopen and when do we start to reopen? And because we're getting so many mixed messages, it creates more and more confusion. And anytime we start to know, oh yeah, that's where, oh no, there, and we're just sort of trying to figure it all out, and that wobbly aspect, after a while, the body's just going to be like, there's just going to be again another this sort of like this kind of freeze and just sort of shut down kind of response. And so that's what I think a lot of us are experiencing as part of this fatigue part, is this uncertainty and not knowing where to chart our course or where to go. That being said, coming back to noticing where you are and obviously the restrictions that you have, doing the appropriate social distancing, all that being said, is being able to maybe in cases where you can go is to go outside, go out in nature. Often if you do have parks and things that where the spacing is being well kept, and you can kind of approach a park, for instance, and see if if it is open, what's going on there. Kind of keep an eye out what's going on there, have your masks with you and all that kind of stuff. That would be helpful. And being able to keep the appropriate distance and all that. And that would really help out a lot to kind of, we just did this the other day. Our beaches are open up here in Santa Barbara. And unlike a lot of the shots that you see in the news where they always look at the parts that of course are going to be where there's people, like there'll be like 2,000 people at a particular large beach. And of course they narrow in on the couple, like the 5-10% or maybe even less than that are acting like not doing the social distancing. And of course we focusing on that. I actually saw a Twitter thing on like, morons being said by a major publication newspaper and trying to just elicit again this anger and fear and trying to weaponize your attention. And so when you look at those kind of words, you want to be careful about that because obviously they're just trying to monetize your attention. So again, wheeling back is that you look at these public places, it's out in nature, things that you can do. That would help out and like get, in a sense, and just look at the lay of the land. Most people are practicing social distancing out there. We're not all just going around just ignoring things. I mean, there is a small portion of that, but do that and allow yourself to kind of experience that and be able to start doing new things. I think that's going to be very, very helpful, not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Of course, your body's going to get kind of bored from that. It's just sort of the natural thing of the mind if we just keep doing the things repetitively over and over again.
Yeah, and I think you hit on another feeling that has been common for me, but I also kind of just see out in the ecosphere. This is the anger. Whether it's angry at the restrictions being too harsh, or the opposite, where you do see images people on the beach, and you're like, no, like you're ruining this effort, and people are going to get sick. And it's like not fun to go into that, but it feels like there is this sort of at least to me, it feels like I'm getting angry at these things that like, they're not really like front and center in my direct experience.
Yeah, I think what you just brought up right now is kind of the portal out of that, and is that noticing your direct experience and noticing the juxtaposition between what it's like in your direct experience and what you're noticing as you kind of get into that informational ecology, which is highly tainted right now, especially either on news or in the internet. The information ecology is mainly being incentivized to weaponize your attention. So you have to be very careful, looking at the words that people use. I mean, oftentimes, I do a lot of psychotherapy, and words have power. And you want to look at those exaggerated words like horrible and are surging and hemorrhaging and then just sort of more judgmental words. Like I said, I never thought I'd hear a newspaper use the word morons or something along the line like name calling. I mean, those kind of things, you start hearing those things, you have to protect your informational ecology that you're exposing yourself to, because you think it doesn't, some of you may not think it matters. It does. It gets in. There's a reason why they're doing that kind of language. It works. That's why the thing is, like, the internet becomes like a giant test market. They can send out things, one way and the other, and they notice which one gets the most likes, which one gets the most. It doesn't matter whether you're being, you're kind of so-called like socking it back to them or not. They got your attention. They won either way. So when you notice that, it's very similar to your mind. Oftentimes you get thoughts, some thoughts that you just know, like, oh, if I don't want to really think about that right now. So, but you're kind of like, and then you're fighting it. You're trying to get rid of that particular thought. Does that usually work? Often not, because you're giving it your attention now. That's what it wanted. That's what gives that thought a chance to keep coming back. You're purchasing the thought with your attention. You're also literally purchasing with your time, and that purchasing with whatever they're using, any kind of this inflammatory language. So you want to be very conscious of this language, see what is going on, and recognizing, is that helping me? When I'm done, like if I've been on Twitter or something, was that helpful? How does my body feel? How was it like before I went on? How was it like when I went, now that I'm off of it? What's the difference like? Keep track of that stuff. And that way you can also kind of titrate how long you spend in certain ones, and also eliminate certain areas where after a while, this is not really helping me out. Overall, this is going to be a long haul. This is not going to be something that ends in a week or two, a month or two, this is going to continue to have, I mean, whether we start, we're going to open things up and then maybe there's a second wave or anything, but this is the time to start to develop these sort of other skills to keep you in balance.
And it feels like there's a feedback loop where, because this is such a novel situation, but we're also at home, we're on the news more. And then, it like you get the angry feeling and it just sort of feeds into itself. And it's really interesting. Some of these social media products, like, Twitter at times have been toxic to me, at least like how I feel inside, that I've, gone off of the platform for long periods of time. But then now with the novelty of the pandemic and me wanting to know more, like I've re-opted in, but then I sort of get subject to this like flywheel of anger and these types of things. And yeah, it's pretty nasty.
And you could see the way it picks too, because I just started getting on, when we started having the pandemic. That's the only time I started really going on Twitter at all. But I also noticed how they push forward certain things. Even if you have your certain favorites, like if you're trying to control the people you'll listen to, they still try to shoot other things at you because they realize those things will kind of grab your attention. So it's a tricky situation. I mean, the positives, because if you get the right experts, they have certain access to certain types of articles that would be helpful to read. But then it's like they have you have a good piece of healthy food, but then it's surrounded by all these like tempting like little snacks and all that stuff. And then you're like, oh, come on, I'm just going to do that. Why not? Because it's associated a little bit with that fatigue you brought up in the beginning. There's a sort of kind of a sense of one way to describe it, it's almost like a slight deadening, because you're just doing things repetitively over and over again. It's hard to feel like you're kind of developing in certain cases, and that, for people who are really kind of locked down. And so you want to feel a little bit of aliveness. So what they're doing is they're giving you this junk aliveness, this sort of junk vitality that comes from anger, rage, fear, blame, all those kind of other emotions, really getting at our primal circuitry there. And again, like as I put it before, weaponizing it so that they can gain your attention, which is what they want. And then they learn from that, you reply, and then they say, oh, great, that's going to work again. And they'll keep doing it. And it's sort of like a transaction approach, which then gets you caught up and feeling kind of more fatigued after. You might play that surge of vitality, but when you're done, you're like, ugh. And it's an uncomfortable kind of low energy. It's not that one that you get from like a good workout or having done something of value.
Yeah, it's more akin to eating too many donuts.
Are you still on that one, Jim?
Yeah, oh, hell yeah. Next, I want to ask you about it's kind of this like in the direction of making positive change. And to get there, I want to start with this idea of group behavior. So Australia has done well with the number of cases in coronavirus, and I've seen a marked change in how people behave to one another when they're out and about. So it's still social distancing, but that sort of tenseness where like everyone is staying away from each other, like really aggressively, and also people would avoid eye contact with strangers almost at all costs, because it like there's like almost like a pull if you made contact to come close to someone. So people were a bit afraid of that. So that, in a large part, is starting to relax in this place where, the signs are pretty good. And so it has me thinking a bit about this dynamic between what people in a group are doing and then our own personal beliefs. So suppose we were in an area where we had a personal belief that the statistics of the epidemic aren't really ready to ease the quarantine. But then when we go out and about, the sort of people are starting to, they're just tired of it, and they're like closer to. How do you what in general do you say about like this sort of like group behavior? Like it feels like how I feel about myself can get like validated by like, oh yeah, if everyone else feels safe, like I'm just gonna kind of let go. Should we stay true to like maybe our own beliefs about how we feel the epidemic's going, and like keeping these behaviors, even in cases where maybe people are like gathering on a beach and, like that kind of feeling like, okay, it must be okay if like everyone else is doing it.
Yeah, that's a very good point you made there. And it's like, because we try to, what we're getting at, and one of the problems overall with, I wouldn't say problem, but like I say, a side effect of the social isolation is that we generally get a sense of reality is a shared experience. We agree upon what is kind of real and not real for some sense. That's why I often find people who retreat away from other people and go into they can have like they can eventually start to have hallucinations and those kind of things, because we are a social tribal species. So and it's why a lot of those other experiments that have shown how well we would conform to people, like oftentimes I forget the names of them, but they have these experiments where they show a bunch of lines, and one of them is obviously like the largest line, and the other ones are not, and then they'll have all the rest of the class and the one who's just a subject that's unwittingly pick like the smallest one and say which is the biggest line, and they're picking all the smallest one, and the person's like what, and then after a while they do it a while, the person will start to pick what the rest of the class picks. So these are powerful kind of undercurrents to try to conform, because in the past when we were tribes, if we didn't conform to our tribes, that could be we could put ourselves into survival danger. So a lot of us have that. So it's understandable to recognize that part of you that does get, oh yeah, that's probably okay. You know, we're seeing all that, you know, all those behaviors going on. And then there's the other part when you're not looking at those behaviors, like, oh, I don't really know, because I also might have people around me where if they got it, they may be more likely to have a severe case. So there's a lot of different factors there. So it comes back to what we were talking about before, and that is, what is your values? And also paying attention to what your body and what it's, you know, kind of getting a sense of what it needs and what it wants, and giving that your attention. And then before you go out, like if you're having some concern whether you might get taken in by that, is if you have, like, say you're going out with someone that you know that way, is that you both talk about it beforehand. Prime yourself as to what, like, you know, yeah, I've noticed sometimes I have this sort of leaning in, almost kind of relaxing my maybe social distancing when I maybe see a friend or something like that, because there could be this sort of, a lot of the things we do is habitual. You're not really thinking of it consciously. If we thought about everything consciously, it would just overwhelm our brain circuitry. So I remember even in the beginning, before the actual social distancing was fully on, there was that tendency where you could have decided whether to shake hands or not. And I just noticed, like, you know, the hand kind of going out, and then you're just like, no. it's hard because it's so well ingrained.
Yeah. And then, so those, you feel you're drawn to like connecting with people, and so now you're like fighting that instinct to do it.
Yeah, and we know too. I think her name is Julian Halstead. She did a lot on the loneliness epidemic when that was coming out, and she correlated with her research that, you know, the more and more isolated we become, it's like I think, I forget the exact numbers, but it was something along the lines, it corresponded like the more and more alone we come, it was like related to actually smoking 15 cigarettes a day, the mortality consequences of such. So we are feeling a not only, it's a psychological, physical thing. It's not, so we often have in our society that there's a difference between the mind and the body. And this has been shattered long time ago with all the neuroscience that we have recently. And anyone who still considers these two separate are just not up on their neuroscience in this case. They're just two sides of the same coin. So they both affect each other. It's just where it's coming from, where it's initiating, and then how it's impacting. But they both impact. Like, for instance, right now, I could say a sentence or two right now and completely change your physiology. Just the right amount of words, the way I could say it, just being a complete ass, you know, I can certainly change your physiology really quickly. So is that mind or is that body? I mean, your heart rate would go up, your blood pressure would go up, you know, like I said, that easily. So we want to look at how those both two relate to each other and how they impact each other in this case. So I think by bringing that all together, you can just get a better appreciation of just kind of knowing. I think the main thing here is to, before you go out and before you do these things, getting back outside to the group mind effect, is to talk with your partner, kind of come out with an idea beforehand, recognize that there's going to be an actual desire that is a healthy desire to want to connect, and knowing with your values and knowing all the other information, what your boundaries are, what you're willing to commit to, so that when the time comes, you've already primed yourself on how to react on that. So you accept it all, and then you work with that. So it's helpful to know that that is a real need and a real healthy need, but also how to fulfill that need in another way that may not put you or your loved ones in some sort of situation that might not be that healthy.
Yeah, it's a very unique situation for us,
My God,
the
yeah.
mind and body are connected, but we're also interdependent on everyone else's mind and body and how they're
Yes.
feeling around these things, and they influence ours, as you say. Cool. So, like, I want to connect this idea of how group behaviors influence us. This other idea that people have talked about coming out of this pandemic is the opportunity for change. And
Mm-hmm.
so by that, I mean both small changes that we can make in our lives for the better, like adopting positive habits, to larger ones that maybe are tied around like the possibility of movements to change the world on like a bigger scale. So like, just to take an example of that,
Mm-hmm.
suppose there's like a bunch of them out there, but like suppose I see stories on like a lot of disruptions to the supply of meat.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about the scale at which we farm and cultivate animals for consumption. And, we're at a point where there's, a lot of people who feel that this causes environmental damage. It may not
Mm-hmm.
be the most healthy to eat that much meat. There's also the suffering of the animals themselves. And so, not to like proselytize this particular idea, but as an example of, hey, like now's a chance coming out of this pandemic. Like, what if we were all to start or, do more of or do less of this particular thing? Like what if we all ate less meat and it, was just better for the world? Now, on the other hand, there's like the idea to do this thing, but there's also like the group behaviors and like social norms that are what they are, right? We, at least in America, and like, in particular, I'm not a vegetarian. Like I do eat meat. And part of that I feel like propped up by the, what other people do around me. So it's kind of a long way to get to this question, but as we sort of like feel energized and like want to make some changes, like how could we think about the sort of like societal norms and like the change we want to make in our lives, and like if those things are opposed to one another, how can we like move forward and like be positive about that?
Yeah. The key here is what we had discussed a little bit before, is really understanding your value system. Like, what is it that you value? When I often take clients into value work, because I do that a lot, and it really helps, because as I mentioned before, the difference between a goal and a value is a kind of a, it's an idea that helps, that resonates with you at your core. For instance, like, learning. Some people just find that when they learn even a little bit, it fills them. It gives them a sense of just sort of a fulfillment, and it allows them to kind of feel a little more vitality in their system. So when I work with a client where that's one of their strong values, they may do something where, hey, maybe 10 minutes a day, you read a book, and then if it wants to go longer than 10 minutes a day, then go on and do that. But the idea is that if that you feel like that might be your value, is the only way you're going to know. You can't think yourself into what you value. You have to, that gives you a clue, and then you're sensing your body like, yeah, that sounds like it might be one of my values. Then you have to experiment and try it out. And then from that experiential experiment, it will tell you whether that's something you value or not. So I call that value sprouting, where you have an idea that, like, for instance, in the case of the meat part, you said you'd normally eat meat, for instance, and now you're noticing, that maybe there's some benefits to reducing your meat consumption, as you're noticing there's might be an opportunity as things are closing down. What would you say, if I were to ask you, like, what do you think is the underlying value driving that for you?
Reduction of the meat consumption.
Yeah.
Well,
And just sense, but don't just think about it. Sense your body as you do it, to see, while you're thinking it out, whether that actually resonates on a deeper level, on a somatic level.
Yeah, I want to try to connect with that. I feel, I feel like a bit of guilt. I feel like there's a carelessness to it. The world has so much already that I don't need to take as much. And then I'm unwilling to look like really behind, it's maybe like I feel better about it if we're like the hunter-gatherer days, where like, I kill what I need only. Feeds my family, and that sustains us. That's like a big difference between now, where it's I eat meat at convenience, and it's like animals are just suffering, and the supply chain of them, they're going to have to cull them because they can't even sell them and they can't keep them alive either. It's just really terrible. And I feel like, you know what, when will that change? You know, when will that change? So I feel this sort of pull to be a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. So that guilt feeling, let's go a little bit deeper with that, because it's helpful to kind of uncover more there than because with guilt, there's always something else along with it, because if you would have guilty only if you felt some sort of connection here. There's something that means something to you about that. Because the guilt is just, all right, I feel like I'm doing something, quote unquote, I'll just put wrong, just to keep it simple. Or, and I should do something better. Let's go deeper though. What is driving that feeling to feel that is wrong and desire for something better? Let this sort of wash over you, and just, again, there's no right answer here. It's just to kind of see what's elicited by that.
I think different tones come up at different times. The one that does is this, you know, we have our own experience, what is being alive, and but then, you know, other beings suffer too.
Mm-hmm.
And I, you know, feel this, you know, bit of sadness about something like a pig, which is a highly emotionally evolved animal, just being, you know, raised in terrible conditions, and not wanting to see that because I like bacon. You know, it's almost funny, right, to say, like, it's like I like this pleasure of eating this more than I'm willing to like face this other kind of feeling.
And now that you are kind of facing this feeling, what's it like?
Yeah, I don't know. This is a tough one for me, because I think there's some things that when I kind of go into, it just sort of becomes like obvious. Like, yeah, like, you know, the second you see something isn't worth it, you just kind of see that. Whereas here, I feel like just also like this conflict. Like, yeah, at times I'll say this, and yet I'm going to contradict myself and enjoy a hamburger like within the next week. And that sort of feels like I don't like admitting that about myself.
Yeah. And so, and that took courage to just even say that right now, because we all have that experience. It's not, if anyone says they're 100%, you know, always telling you the truth, I can tell you right now, they're full of shit. I don't care. There's just no way you can know all the different conscious, unconscious processes that are leading. We're gonna always do some things that we do as I say, not as I do, kind of thing, to some extent that might happen. And because we flip-flop, it's not like you're 100% consistent. We're not robots. We change, and depending on the context, and just like you were saying before, when I'm in groups, I notice that I might be acting a little bit differently. There's different parts of us that are brought out. So how you are with me right now as we're being recorded and it's going to be on YouTube is going to be different than how you are with your wife right after this, or how you're going to be with your kids. There's different parts of you that come up, and those different parts have different likes and desires. I mean, there's usually continuity, obviously, in these things, but there's going to be slight shifts and what you focus on. And we're quickly to kind of like just kind of get into our old habits and not really being present with what's going on. So it's understandable that you might perform certain actions that maybe just a couple hours ago, you might have been saying, yeah, I'd really like not to do that. How many times have you tried to start a habit, like, I'm really going to do this and all that kind of stuff, and then find yourself maybe a week later sort of like, oh, shit, here I am, not doing those things.
Yeah,
and so that's really just hard. A part of so it's just about being human. So rather than when you probably experienced that before, and like I said, myself included as well, where you feel that kind of like, you're kind of feeling a little bit jammed in between two spots like that, where you're like, yeah, and I know maybe later I'll be eating, going to, I guess over in California, we would go to In-N-Out and just start, chopping down on some burgers. When just before, you might have even gotten into a heated argument about how we have to save the animals from all that kind of stuff. And so you kind of notice that. So that's actually I know it's uncomfortable, but that's a good spot to be in. It's one of the reasons why those of us who are looking to really be courageous in this and understand ourselves and be able to evolve and grow is this willingness to be with that discomfort and to kind of like come back and be conscious. Because if we suppress it, with donuts or coffee, no, I'm just kidding, or alcohol or anything else that we might do, watching TV, but it's to actually be with that conflict and to sense into it. And eventually, by giving that your attention, I was just working with a client recently on this, where they were struggling between two things, and is to go, where do you feel the struggle in there? Because that's where the heart of the struggle is inside your body. If it was only in the thought stream, it wouldn't really bother you. It only really bothers you because if you were totally relaxed, in other words, it wouldn't really bother you. Just, I have these two thoughts that are kind of doing their little thing, but whatever. It's because when that happens, you feel that dissonance inside of your body. It feels like there's a sort of confusion and there's a sort of conflict that's going on. That, as we were talking about, is your opportunity. If you're looking for the opportunity to change, it's there. It's there in that discomfort, is the willingness to explore that. Now, you may need some outside assistance to kind of help guide you so you don't get caught into one cul-de-sac or the other, but that will allow you to kind of really take a look, get closer look, rather than just avoiding and saying, well, and beating yourself up with a judge of some sort, which then just shuts down the lens again. But it's to be open and be conscious. There's an opportunity, as you're saying, is to be more conscious of your actions, not to be so like obsessive and make sure that I have to do everything perfectly, but to see whether your actions are in alignment with your deepest values. I think you brought up with that gentleman that you saw who was telling you, well, those are your values, the one that you're behaving and the ones that you're aspiring to. Well, yes and no. I think that's just one way to put it, to kind of shock the person, to be like, okay, now I want to do that. It is a strategy of sorts. But it's really, a lot of times we're not conscious of it because we're so influenced by the group, by the society, by culture, all that stuff, that conditioning. So these times of isolation is an opportunity for yourself, as you've been conditioned by the rest of the group, to kind of just sense, be able to get an idea of what's going on there. And so just getting back to where you are right now with this and understanding that internalized conflict, my question would be like, besides the feeling that might be wrong or that you should be better, and then you brought in that the sadness part, you said, I felt sad. See, did you notice when you said that, and I hope other people could see it on here, that your body actually went down a notch when that happened, that the sadness allowed you to kind of feel, there was actually a more okayness in your body to be sad than it was to be in that kind of struggling with the like, was this bad or not? So you said, yeah, I'm feeling sad. It was a more vulnerable spot. You became more open to that. And then if you went into that sadness and you were just saying, yeah, I recognize that, and how you brought up the pigs may have intelligence. I tend to value the idea that things that can have these, very powerful, potentially conscious experiences, what I want them to be in these sort of, these like slaughterhouses that are just kept in just, in really kind of almost horrific, well, not almost, actually horrific conditions. Is that something that I want to kind of promulgate with my purchasing? And what would I like to do? So, and these things are not to be perfect about it, but to make the choice then based on that value of maybe the love of some other creature that has intelligence that you don't want to see suffer, as opposed to the badness and guilt part, which just has this sort of tension. And it's that guilt that can be then weaponized, because on the other side of guilt, because it's like, it feels like uncomfortable, it's easy to get anger and to kind of project out anger and resentment really quickly when you're feeling that unease. It just doesn't feel comfortable. So that can be weaponized. But the sadness, that can be connected to that which is sad also means that something is meaningful that you're being sad about, and what that meaning is and what that feels like in your body to have that meaning, and to let that guide you.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's some of the discomfort that's coming from the internal inconsistency, sort of a feeling of lack of agency. And then there's also the piece that connects more to groups, and maybe like this originates from a culture, and not all cultures are so meat centric. but there's also, hey, okay, like, all right, I feel pretty good about this, and I'm gonna like change my diet, and then I drive past a McDonald's and a hamburger joint, and then the butcher and the meat section in the supermarket, and then you
All
go to
at
your
once.
buddy's, yeah, then you go to your buddy's barbecue, and there's just like a big pig of meat there, or you throw your own barbecue, and like they're like, well, where's the hamburgers? And you're like, oh yeah, well, there's sort of I think there's another side of things, which is like yeah, being okay with thinking and acting for yourself,
Mhm.
even when it's sort of maybe goes against the flow a bit.
Yeah. And I think the clear, like, I think right now where you're at is you're in that little bit of the struggle. And in that case, I would suggest to that person is, well, you don't know yet. You feel like there may be something here that's meaningful to you. So why don't you just don't try to don't turn it on as like a binary switch. I'm going to go from, complete veganism after I've been playing, but would potentially just lowering the meat or choosing different sources of meat where it's more expensive to pay for the grass-fed, pasture-raised kind, and really knowing, maybe going out to the farmers markets and appreciating the speaking to the people who are actually doing, slaughtering the meat and doing it in a way, and getting a sense of whether how humane they may or may not be and how they're doing it. That there's other gradations that may be a more balancing point for you, because there could be, what I found also in a biological sense, there's a battle between the vegans and vegetarians and the ketos and the paleos and all that other stuff. But what I have found in my 10 years experience, having been brought up with a very powerful nutritarian, which is heavily plant-based, but there was always a little bit of room for meat in that case. And I have found that in that case, that people with their large range of biodiversity require different levels of meat. Generally, it's a much less than what we do in the United States. But there are a couple of people who tend to do better with a little bit of meat in their diet, but it doesn't need to be a lot. Generally, in the area of like 2 ounces here and there. But again, as you sense your body, you'll find what's balancing for it. So if you get its sort of biological kind of need and what that's satisfying, it becomes a lot easier then to deal with maybe some of the conditioning that might have been brought about from continuous meat use. And then, because it does require a certain amount of planning, so you may want to experiment with just making those subtle decisions, whether it's to just buy certain types of meat that are like less likely to be offensive to the environment or to the particular animal, or to and then I think just going in that direction rather than immediately switching off, because each one will teach you more about the different struggles and the challenges that faces, whether it's going into restaurants, which restaurants you pick, that kind of thing. So it's a big decision, and it's a tough one, and it's not something you're going to do. There's no such thing as doing this perfectly. And in fact, even if you did it all the way where you just always did it, I would have some suspicions that there's just a bit of rigidity there. So it's to be adaptive, attentive, and continuing to sense into your values and your body and let it guide you. And when you feel the dissonance, it's nothing wrong. It just means confusion. That's it. It doesn't mean bad or wrong. I want to get that off. It means confusion. There's something in conflict. There's something to be explored. So whether you can do that on your own, whether you want to have someone else to help help you with that and give different perspectives, it's just a calling to examine and to really explore.
Yeah, I think like really fascinating about the pandemic is I think a lot of people see this as such an opportunity for large scale change. And yet when it comes down to it, large scale change, when it means changes of behavior, it's for each one of us, okay, the rubber hits the road. If this is something that you've been doing and impacts your life, like, oh, okay, I'm going to, sell my car and try to take public transit, assuming that the pandemic is not a problem with that. Well, okay, now you've just changed how you get to work, and like that could be more inconvenient for you. And so then you sort of have to struggle with like that trade-off. So like, yeah, like I think I'm really fascinated by, on the outside of this, do we end up with a very similar world, or is there enough movement around this sort of large scale opinions that more and more people can overcome some of that, just resistance to change, because it's uncomfortable. Like, to even like talk about my own inconsistency, it wasn't so comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of people, when it comes to changing their lives, is like think about it or feel about it that way.
Yeah. And cool. I think I just want to bring up, it's that your willingness to do that here, like I said, was I want to really highlight is an extraordinarily courageous thing to do, because and I seen a couple, actually Eric Weinstein actually will often talk about his own hypocrisy on there. He's like, yeah, I sometimes will lie, and I see a couple, and I appreciate that kind of what I would say is just very authentic honesty about, you know, just what it's like to be a human being. And again, we're not here to be perfect. We're here to kind of just continue to grow, learn, and adapt, and just express ourselves in the most meaningful way that we find resonating with us. And so I think it's a helpful thing. And to also bring up the idea that I think one thing that this could be helpful, because we're all experiencing different levels of discomfort right now. And is we automatically have this label: discomfort equals bad and comfort equals good. And that equation needs to be examined on a very deep level. And is one of the reasons why we tend to go for the ultra convenience and not want to look under the hood as to what's driving that convenience and those kind of things. And even looking at it from there, the idea of convenience. Yeah, do I have to get to work at this particular time, that quickly, or could I enjoy actually the transitional period? Just because, maybe when you're going, you're always just thinking about, all right, when am I going to get there? When I get there, as opposed to perhaps there's an opportunity to read a book when you're on transit. You don't have to worry about, going through the traffic or whatever it is that your decisions are. It's just that it's the way you look at it. Each thing has a constraint. Even the one that's most quote unquote convenient has constraints around it. So this is just another area of control, and then you can then insert what would be a way I can creatively work with that and help me. And also, what would it be like to actually be committed to something that really, if it really matters to you, and you're doing the commitment, not because you're doing it because you want to look good. If you want to look good, it will lose its steam pretty quickly. But if you want to do it because it actually comes from something deep inside, it will empower you. You will feel the energy from that. There's something there. It will then create a positive momentum that will then start to spread into other areas. Because if you could do a little bit of inconvenience here, which then no longer becomes an inconvenience because you recognize that trap right there. That's the brain trying to bring you back to the status quo. Because that's what you're seeing here. And you see this on a societal level, and you see this on a personal level, that we make some changes, and then there's it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that kind of thing. And that's just natural. The body's very rarely, and our mind's very rarely going to go shoot over. And then there's a reason for that. It's that we maintain it. It doesn't want to go too far into one direction too. There's mechanisms to try to keep things back in, and it has this sort of breathing kind of like I would say pattern to it.
Yeah, I like the idea too that you brought up of bringing creativity or playfulness or sort of positivity to the decision. And even if it's going to move back and forth, just kind of give it that extra, no, this isn't a sacrifice. This is kind of fun. Let's explore. It's not easy all the time, but hey, yeah, I get to read a book on the bus. That's
yeah.
kind of, I really enjoy it. Look at all the audio books that I'm kind of getting through maybe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really cool. Cool. So one more topic, and this one is coming from a question that you received around fixations.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess ostensibly the scenario is we're alone together or alone by ourselves in these apartments, and perhaps we're getting caught in recurring thoughts, or always coming back to the same types of thoughts and feelings, and sort of obsessiveness about that.
Yeah.
What can you say about to the extent that that's occurring, what the self-isolation does to amplify that, and how can we approach it?
Yeah, so a lot of us are very uncomfortable being alone. And that's been something, I think those of us who have gone into, whether it's meditative training, those kind of things, who tend to be more extroverted, maybe have just naturally very active minds, find the great unease that can be to kind of sit alone in that kind of experience. And so I think a lot of us who were never called to that are now brought into this situation where you have potentially a lot of alone time. So you're now in that kind of range where what you do is, our favorite distraction is to go up into thinking, problem solving, thinking. Remember, we talked about rumination. When you're thinking, when your brain can do time traveling, you can travel into the past and think about all that stuff, wishing there was a better past, or that person should have done this, or there's resentment, or kind of feeling regret because you should have done this or shouldn't have done that, those kind of things. And that, again, leads yourself into feelings of depression. You know, that's the kind of one of the biggest cognitive risk factors for that. Or you start thinking about the future. What about this? What about that? With all the insecurity, I mean, your brain is like a virtual reality system that's going to just create whatever types of potential horrors that you can think of. What we call daymares. You know, you're just getting, instead of a nightmare, you're getting caught up in this kind of day virtual reality system of this mare that's going on, and then you're just wondering what might happen. And of course, there's no answer to any of that stuff. So it just kind of has this sort of cul-de-sac feeling to it, where in that worrying aspect, it just kind of continue on. And again, you're feeling unease in the body. Of course, that would lead more to anxiety. So when you're dealing with a lot of the thoughts, what I deal with when I have a lot of clients who are telling me I'm getting fixated on whether it's a particular person or whether it's my job, where like there's a certain amount that might be helpful. And then there's another point where it becomes either ruminative or worrying. It has that sort of looping kind of quality to it. And it's first to gain that discernment, you know, depending, like when I generally say if it's something like, if it's a person, for instance, if it's longer than 5 minutes and you haven't figured, if it hasn't led to any kind of solution, it's probably not going to be helpful. You need to kind of take a break and do something. So whether it's to change your scenery of some sort and do something on an environmental level, put music on, something else to kind of change the way it is, but that's still a kind of a slight bypass. The get to the core is if you're having a rumination or a worry, anytime it's doing that, what I would first recommend, and there's a lot of resistance to this because we don't want to face it. It's one of the reasons why it keeps continuing. What we resist kind of persists, the old cliche, and that is to write it down. Write it down and be specific about it. And then as you're writing it down, the thing to know, and this is something that, like I said, came out, I think first with, maybe not first, but it was brought up a lot by Antonio Damasio and his somatic marker hypothesis, and a lot of other people after that, kind of seeing the primacy of emotions and how it dictates, basically it dictates the range of thoughts that we have access to. So what that kind of implies then is that when we're getting caught up in a kind of, oftentimes when we're ruminating or obsessing in some fashion, it's because there's an emotion that's driving that. There's emotion driving that range of thinking. And what the problem is that it's a closed system. It's a closed loop based on the range, based on that particular emotion that you're feeling. And oftentimes we don't want to deal with that because we haven't been, you know, a lot of us haven't been able to work with our own emotions. So what I generally recommend when I work with clients is that notice when that's happening. That's step one, is to notice when that obsessional style thinking is happening. When that's happening, write it down. That's the first thing. That way there's a potential, like if the brain's like, I need to think about this. Well, you know, I got it on paper here. And there can be a kind of reassurance. I'm not going to forget about this. It's right here. It's like there. So it can almost give the brain a little bit of an opportunity to be like, okay, at least it's down there, and I don't necessarily have to keep revivifying it in your mind. And then the other thing is then there's always an emotion driving it. So what you want to do is you're up here, your attention's up here. Is like, all right, where's the heart? What's the pump that's generating that? And the pump is always in the body. So you want to go down into the body and sense where is that unease, to kind of go to be there with it. And as long as it's not a higher than, say, like I said, a 7 or 8 level of intensity, but otherwise you want to do something physical to kind of help calibrate that down into what I call the emotional learning zone between 2 and 7. You then allow yourself, then if you notice you're in that 2 to 7 space, it's like uncomfortable, but it's not so overwhelming. Then you can start to sense into what's going on, and maybe it's a tightness or a looseness or a heaviness. And just by being there, what we now know in that type of sensing, what we call interoception, you know, internal receiving is what interoception means. It means how we experience our body from within. That area, there's where we are conscious and where we're not conscious. So it kind of goes in this kind of range. The kind of the intersection between where we're not conscious and where we're conscious is the sensations in our body. So by giving our attention right at the point of those sensations, we're kind of hovering our conscious attention right at the point where the non-conscious mind is right there. And so there's these times where you get these breakthroughs through the non-conscious mind into the conscious space. And if you're paying attention, meaning you're open to the sensations, you might start to uncover some of these patterns, some of the things that you might have avoided a lot of times we develop obsessions when we're younger, when we're like in more sort of immature mind states. And if we become aware of them now by giving our attention to our sensations, we might realize that what was once there was confusion, there's now clarity for. What's once might have been something that I felt like I needed at that particular time, I know how to fulfill those needs right now. That can happen often. Or at least now you get more clarity if there is still a need that needs to be met, what that is, and then to be able to address it more head on as opposed to continuing to kind of chase your tail. So I would say that would be a good way to start to work with the obsessional kind of pattern.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned that, there's two parts of it, right? There's the discerning when you're in one of these closed loops,
yes,
and you're working with it. On the discerning side, how do you know that you even need to discern? Like, are other people giving you feedback that you keep talking about the same thing, or what brings you to like even want to discern? Oh, okay, am I going off really like a little bit too far again?
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that's obvious to people, or is it something they have to learn?
It varies. It varies. Some people are just where it's more personality quality. They're the obsessional nature, so that's just kind of closer to who they are, and we often don't see what's closest to us. Like we said, the old adage is that an eye can see everything but itself. Without a mirror. A scale can weigh everything but itself. So when things that are closest to who we feel we are usually the things we're most blind to. They're just too close to us. So if you have what we call an obsessive compulsive personality disorder as opposed to OCD, if we're going to go into the disorder area here, it's harder for them to recognize. Usually those people come into my office based on enough loved ones telling them to get their ass in here and start doing some introspection. Those of us who just may have that sort of obsessive quality, but it's not deeply ingrained in our personality structure, often you're aware of just sort of an unease in the body. And by paying attention to that, or it might have felt like this sort of kind of, like I said, junk food vitality, like you're getting into that rage, blame, that kind of thing, fear kind of thing, but usually the rage, blame, and it feels like a certain power behind it, but then afterwards you sort of feel depleted. Is understanding the consequences of that. It's kind of like when you take a drug and you might feel great while you're taking the drug, but when you notice the withdrawal, so when you're working with people with issues with drug dependency, you want to get them to link their brain not just to the pleasure that they got, but to the consequences later and later on down the line. So there are various ways to kind of be able to attune when it's out of balance. There may be times when you are kind of being more obsessive, but it's not totally out of balance, and that might not be something that you have to be too concerned about. But when it's constantly bringing you out of balance and you can feel the unease, I would say that's where you can start to, if you check in with your body enough, you can just do it, like I said, a 30-second check-in every now and then you notice if there's a tightening, heaviness, all this kind of other feelings, achiness, all that kind of stuff. You may want to ask what might be kind of throwing you a little off balance at that point.
Yeah. In a previous part of my career, I was on the team at Facebook that was working on the misinformation problem. And I think just very visibly, and there's been some studies on this, that with the coronavirus pandemic, the amount of misinformation actually increased. And there's different types of misinformation, but I wonder, like, to tie it to fixation, whether some of the conspiratorial ideas that aren't necessarily political, like the idea that coronavirus is caused by 5G cell phone towers. Is that related to sort of like a fixation of ideas, and do those things tie together?
Yeah, there's a lot of influence from many of these things. I go back to Jaak Panksepp. So we talked about the panic grief system earlier in this conversation we were having. There's another system that's very powerful. It's called the seeking system. It's what gives you that kind of that oomph to initiate new things, to do things, to kind of be motivated to accomplish goals. That feeling that you get. Otherwise, when that gets shut down, that happens oftentimes in major depressive, when it gets shut down. we get what's called like anhedonia, and without hedonia, pleasure, the inability to experience the pleasure that we get from doing the things that we find meaningful, things that you would normally enjoy, like being with friends, and all of a sudden you're just deadened. So that anhedonia, not being able to feel the pleasure. So the seeking system is extraordinarily powerful. It actually basically charges all the other major emotional circuitry. For instance, if you're in fear, and also something's about to attack you, your seeking system will kick in to try to seek an escape route to get the hell out of there. So that's going to empower your fear to find the escape route in there. So the seeking system is really powerful. So when we got closed down, and a lot of us were not expecting this, is a very surprise. A lot of us who are ambitious and have a lot of just a lot of just internal just power and wanting to just do things, and also now you're closed in. It's kind of like now that seeking system hits a wall. And when that happens, oftentimes there's rage that comes out from that. When someone blocks you from something that's important, like say there's something that you wanted to accomplish, and now the economic environment has changed radically, and so that thing that you were just about you're all ready to go, and then all of a sudden there's nowhere to go, and all that energy is coming up at you. So the seeking system is driven by dopamine in the body. So the dopamine in the lower part of the brain, so in what we call the subcortical part, which is just below the cortex. That part is also where a lot of obsessive compulsive issues go into. That's often in a place called the caudate nucleus in there, is often attributed to some OCD-like symptoms. So that dopamine, as it gets increased, and now you have rage on board. The rage is often going to make you feel unsettled, and now you're trying to figure out how to get out, and you're that caged animal, and you're still in the cage, so hard to fall asleep when that happens. So when you don't fall asleep that well, there's also that's another indicator why some people might feel more energy as they kind of go past their window of opportunity to fall asleep, is that what happens is when that happens, our dopamine levels start to rise again. So now you have this this thwarted seeking system, very powerful, and now also anger coming on board. Now you also have sleep deprivation coming in, and then your dopamine levels are going higher and higher and higher. So it's just like when people take, say, methamphetamine, which really dumps a whole bunch of dopamine into the system. I used to treat a lot of methamphetamine addicts when I was working at the ACT team over in Santa Barbara at the county level. That what you would often see is when they weren't on meth, oftentimes they'd be completely fine, but when they were on, they would have all these paranoid delusions. They would always make all these connections. They would see, if they saw two things that we even sort of remotely connect, whether in time or space, or their brain could create some story to make some sense out of it, it will. When the dopamine gets higher enough, there's a tendency to try to make causal relationships to things that are just happening, either just because they're correlated through time or space or through some other means, and we quickly will jump to that. So there's a relationship to that, these systems being thwarted by our current social isolation, and this tendency to get caught up in these higher states of, in that case, potentially dopamine, where it's creating higher tendencies to try to seek causal links, whether or not. And that being said, you also want to be able to keep an open mind as well, and not be totally closed. And I think that means in either direction, whether you are thinking there's something going on, because there are some conspiracies that do pan out to be real, and there's other ones that are just sort of like off the deep end. And so again, this comes down to discernment. And I think the biggest thing is to try to, if you can be open. That's where most people struggle. They want to close it down because that gives them a kind of a false sense of security. But that oftentimes leads you to something that's imbalanced. So by just keeping open, always watching people on both sides of the argument that are intelligent, that will help kind of keep you balanced. Having that dialectic is important. This whole thing of like the right and the left and balancing, when it's done well, and there's not all these other kind of these incentives to kind of play these games that are not helpful, that are not actually giving us true value, but are just games of power, that throws it all off. But if there wasn't that sort of like these sort of inappropriate and just unhelpful incentivization, kind of landscape that we're currently in, and we had that dialectic, you need both the conservative and the liberal mindsets that kind of help provide balance. Too much of one or the other, it's like yin and yang. You don't want to have that. So that's where you can so by setting up a dialectic for yourself, by being too careful when you get too certain about something. Because if you're that certain about something, you could almost guess that you're kind of falling a little bit out of balance. I mean, there's one thing, I don't care what you've been reading or anything. It's that it's different levels of probability, and being able to be okay with that probability. That part is the part where you have to get more okay with this level of uncertainty.
Yeah. And there's that interesting connection back to groups too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we feel more comfortable being certain about positions if there's a whole group behind us that believe the same way or speak in the same way.
Exactly. Yeah. And that also comes back, I mean, and I think just a subtle point there I want to bring up. If that's coming up, like you're feeling a sense of unease, and then all of a sudden you're doing something, and it may not be like if you're going to join something, and that brings the unease down because you're now in a group, because hey, we all think alike. Oh, we feel good, we're forming this group. But when you go from a place of unease, and then and it motivates a behavior to take away the unease, just be careful, because that's negative reinforcement. That's one of the reasons why people get addicted to certain things. You know, oftentimes they're feeling withdrawal, say from like if they were a cocaine addict and they stop, all of a sudden they start feeling withdrawal. So what do? They're not feeling good, so they take the cocaine again so that they can get rid of the unease. That's that negative reinforcement. You know, the negative being that you're taking away a punishment that allows you to reinforce a behavior to happen more likely in the future. So taking away the unease to join a particular group, because that just gives me this sense of security in some way. Be careful. And it's not always a wrong thing. It's just something that should bring up your levels of consciousness, and just be sense into your own self, and also talk to those people who you love and trust, to make sure that you're not going too far in any one direction.
Sounds good. Well, let's wrap up for the day. Any parting thoughts? How has your quarantine experience been in the last month?
That's an interesting way to end it. I mean, it has been, you know, extraordinarily interesting, from like the opportunity times to the times where you're frustrated. I could tell you, I tried to do there was like trying to do some of those kind of different loans, and working with different banks, you know, that I happened to be a part of one of the big bank systems, which was just a complete headache. So just going through the rage circuitry on that particular one, and recognizing in that case, going back is to the going back, kind of like what you're looking at, is like, well, how can we make certain changes that may be, you know, more resonant with our value systems, and when were we sacrificing our values for convenience, and where can I do that and just start practicing a life that's more embodying my values. So again, my desire then to now switch over to supporting more local things, like, you know, we're looking into getting one of those kind of like where they have the fruit and different organic fruit, those kind of services where they come in and where it's all from the local farmers, and supporting local, and going to like community banks. And I think for me, that's what kind of brought up to me, is trying to support local, and then maybe reaching out. I wanted to reach out to try to help a lot of the therapists I sent out to help kind of guide, because I've been on telemedicine, and it takes time to be able to work within this medium. It's not that easy. It doesn't come right off the bat. So trying to reach out and get out to the community, I found great meaning in that. And then in the moments when I get caught in the different things that you're bringing up, the shoulds and shouldn't part, the guilt and the bad parts, and recognizing those kind of parts when they happen. And again, it's the willingness to look like a big idiot sometimes, and just be okay with that we're all like that. We're all idiots at one point or a time. Anyone who says otherwise is full of shit. Yeah. And it's okay. It's okay to do that. Yeah. And we're all gonna lose our shit from time to time, and that's called a par for the course. It's just the way you respond to that makes all the difference. So
yeah, I think it would be a beautiful thing too if we do kind of all come out of this, at least with the intent to think about how we can embody our values more. Like if that becomes an actual thing, it'd be really nice.
Yeah.
All right. Enjoyed speaking with you as always.
Likewise.
Thanks for sharing everything you've learned over the years. It certainly, I find it fascinating and helpful for me, and hopefully for some of the people who watch this as well, they're getting good things out of it.
And also, I think, you know, what other people have said, and I agree with, and I appreciate the courage and like just the openness that you bring about. And that's what I'm also bringing up, my openness. And anytime you also want to make sure that you flip it back on me, by all means, if that calls to you, we'll do it in future programming.
Sure. Take care.
All right. Take care, Jim. Bye-bye.